U.S. warships are striking targets in Venezuelan waters. For the first time in decades, Latin America is on the brink of military confrontation. To many, this is but the latest string of bad news for Venezuela. A country once known for oil wealth is now infamous for poverty, crime, and dictatorship. But how did one of the richest countries in the hemisphere become a failed state? And why is it in conflict with the United States? As we'll uncover in this video, these two things are two sides of the same coin. It all comes down to organized crime and its reach across the world. Now, the story of Venezuela's cartels don't actually start with cocaine. It starts with oil. Because before the cartels took power, it was oil that built the system that would one day take over. In 1922, Shell, formerly known as Royal Dutch Shell, discovered an oil field in the Maracaibo Basin in northwestern Venezuela. This field was able to pump out nearly 100,000 barrels per day, which was extraordinary at the time. Within the next few years, roughly 100 foreign companies began producing oil in Venezuela. In the 1920s, Venezuelan oil production exploded under dictator General Juan Vicente Gomez. By 1929, Venezuela produced 137 million barrels of oil annually. This made the country the second largest oil producer at the time, only behind the United States. By the 1930s, oil accounted for over 90% of Venezuelan exports, making it a petrostate. However, 98% of oil production in Venezuela was still controlled by foreign companies, namely Gulf, Royal Dutch Shell, and Standard Oil. In response, Venezuelan leaders tried to counter this by implementing laws to require those companies to give half of their oil earnings to the government. One such example is the Hydrocarbons Law of 1943. 5 years later, the government's income grew six-fold. Up until then, Venezuela had been struggling with seceding military dictatorships. It wasn't until 1958 that the country finally elected its first stable democratic government. The main political parties agreed to share oil profits proportionally to avoid another dictatorship. However, this only caused oil profits to be almost exclusively concentrated in the government. By 1960, Venezuela became a founding member of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. This group included most countries in the Persian Gulf, as well as Ecuador, Nigeria, and other African countries. The OPEC coordinated prices and gave members more control over their domestic oil industries. By this time, Venezuela created its first state oil company, the Venezuelan Petroleum Corporation. It also increased the tax that foreign oil companies had to pay the state, from 50% to 65%. The 1970s were the peak of Venezuelan power through its oil. In 1973, due to the OPEC embargo imposed on Israel supporters during the Yom Kippur War, oil prices quadrupled. This made Venezuela the richest per capita country in Latin America. In just 2 years, this added $10 billion to the state's pockets. This inevitably caused rampant mismanagement and uncontrollable corruption. The temptation was just too much to pass by. It has been estimated that nearly $100 billion were embezzled between 1972 and 1997 alone. Riding this oil high in 1976, President Carlos Andrés Pérez decided to nationalize oil. He created the state-owned Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., the PDVSA. PDVSA was now responsible for everything related to exploring, producing, refining, and exporting the country's oil. PDVSA was allowed to partner with foreign companies, but it always had to retain at least 60% of the earnings. Even though it was a state company, it was structured to work as a business with little regulation. At last, heading into the 1980s, the Venezuelan dream came crashing down along with oil prices. This sudden drop in oil prices severely shrunk the oil-dependent Venezuelan economy, and inflation went sky-high. It had also gathered tremendous debt because it bought foreign refineries. In 1989, newly elected President Pérez secured a bailout deal with the IMF. This deal included a deeply unpopular fiscal austerity package. This caused violence and riots in the streets. In 1992, amidst the chaos, Hugo Chavez, a military officer, tried and failed to stage a coup. But he rose to national fame. Chavez rode this high tide through the 90s, and finally, in 1998, he was elected president of Venezuela on a socialist platform. He proclaimed a new socialist Bolivarian revolution. During his campaign, Chavez promised to use Venezuela's vast oil wealth to eliminate poverty and inequality. His Bolivarian policies were expensive, but he did reduce poverty by 20%. However, at the time, his government took measures that began to show the decline of Venezuelan oil production. This caused oil production in Venezuela to peak in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, before starting to fall. You see, Chavez fired thousands of PDVSA workers that were on strike in 2002 and 2003. This act eliminated key experienced technicians, severely damaging PDVSA's production capacity. In addition, by 2005, Chavez started to share his country's oil wealth with other socialist countries in the region, like Cuba. This became known as the Petrocaribe Alliance. So, throughout the long presidency of Hugo Chavez, Venezuela's oil reserves dwindled. All of this is due to him giving it away and producing less off of his fields. Now, at the same time, his government became even more indebted, with the national debt nearly doubling. However, Chavez remained very popular among the working class. He used his popularity to extend presidential powers. He became a populist, closing in on authoritarianism. He got rid of presidential term limits, and he took control of the Supreme Court and harassed the press. He also nationalized many private businesses, both national and foreign. He even nationalized oil projects from ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. Now, eventually, Chavez died in 2013, and he was succeeded by Nicolas Maduro. All of the Chavez-era changes allowed Maduro to slowly establish a dictatorship. In 2014, global oil prices fell once again, and with them, the Venezuelan economy. But this time, it was even worse than in the 1980s. You see, for nearly 10 years now, Venezuela has continued to give away oil and produce less at home. Add to that US sanctions to harden the blow. Ever since Chavez started giving oil to Fidel Castro's Cuba, Washington wasn't very happy about it. For that reason, the US imposed severe sanctions against Venezuela, which blocked oil imports from PDVSA. They also banned the Venezuelan government from accessing the US financial system. Maduro tried to soften the blow by printing money, which really only pushed Venezuela into years of hyperinflation. Inflation hit nearly a whopping 10 million% by 2019. The Venezuelan bolivar, the national currency, was almost worthless. And because of this, the country essentially just used the US dollar instead. This all caused many Venezuelans to flee the growing humanitarian crisis in their country. Millions flocked to Colombia and other neighboring countries, and many tried to make the trek to the United States. All of these factors caused unrest at home. However, Maduro used political repression and censorship to keep his people at bay. He also started manipulating elections. In 2018, he won re-election. Nearly 60 countries did not recognize his win as legitimate. Among these countries was the United States. In fact, the US recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as interim leader. You might be asking then, how did Maduro get away with it? How did he keep his regime afloat? The answer lies within its remaining oil trading allies. Among these were Cuba, Iran, Russia, and Turkey. Russia even went as far as sending troops to Venezuela in 2019. Both Russia and China have continued to back the Maduro regime. They've even helped him evade sanctions. In addition to these allies, Maduro has yet another ally in the Middle East, Hezbollah. The Lebanese terrorist organization is directly sponsored by Iran. You see, Tehran and Caracas share the same anti-American sentiments, and both countries are authoritarian regimes. Maduro even joined Iran in vocally supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In 2022, Maduro visited Tehran and signed a 20-year cooperation deal with Iran. He also pledged membership to Iran's so-called axis of resistance against the US and the West. In this context, Maduro has allowed Iran to directly operate in Venezuela. In 2022, a Venezuelan cargo plane was detained in Argentina. It carried 5 Iranians, 2 of which were involved in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. The IRGC itself is also designated as a terrorist organization by the US State Department. Iran has also been allowed to build production plants for military drones, and Maduro has bought Iranian drones. Basically, Venezuela has become Iran's Latin American weapons hub. Iran has also used Venezuela to conduct the same repressive plots that it does at home. For instance, in 2021, the FBI stopped a plot to send a US-based Iranian dissident to Venezuela. From there, they plan to take this activist back to Iran for punishment. This sets the stage for Hezbollah and Venezuela's relationship. Being a proxy of Iran, Hezbollah is allowed the same privileges as the IRGC in Venezuelan territory. Hezbollah has expanded further into South America. It reportedly runs a criminal terror network in the tri-border region of Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. This operation generates huge sums for Hezbollah, building its military capacity. These ties have even allowed Hezbollah to carry out direct attacks on the Western Hemisphere. For example, take the 1992 Hezbollah bombing of the Israeli embassy in Argentina, or take the 1994 Hezbollah attack on a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires. This particular branch of Hezbollah is known as the External Security Organization, or ESO, or Unit 910. In 2020, the US Department of Justice uncovered a narco-terrorism conspiracy. This plot involved multiple parties, including a Syrian-Venezuelan lawmaker, FARC members, drug cartels in Mexico, Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. Even though this larger plot was stopped, Hezbollah's Unit 910 remains completely active in Latin America. It continues to make deals with local drug gangs and cartels, cashing in on the lucrative narcotics trade. The ESO's current leader, Abdallah Safadine, is Hezbollah's envoy to Iran. He's also the Secretary General's cousin. Another key Hezbollah leader in Venezuela is Adham Hussein Tabaja. Tabaja helps run Hezbollah's money laundering schemes in Venezuela. These include sophisticated investment mechanisms and cash and credit-intensive businesses. One of these businesses is Al-Inma Engineering and Contracting. This firm is based in Lebanon and Iraq, and its leader, Jihad Mohammed Kansu, has a Venezuelan passport. Both Tabaja and Safadine have extensive ties to large criminal networks across the region, beyond Venezuela's borders. They have their hands in textiles, beef, charcoal, electronics, tourism, real estate, and even construction. All of these businesses help launder money for Hezbollah. Hezbollah has also exploited the large Lebanese diaspora, not just in Venezuela, but across the region. This is similar to how Venezuelan gangs also exploit their own expats that live abroad. The huge Lebanese community in Venezuela has unknowingly served as logistical professionals to help raise, hide, and move money for Hezbollah. They are employed as lawyers, accountants, or entrepreneurs. Hezbollah's Venezuelan support network is organized in familial clan structures that blend into Maduro's controlled illegal economy. It is also deeply embedded within the regime's inner political circles. So, with all of this support network, Maduro further cemented his regime. In 2021, he manipulated yet another election, this time the legislative elections. He took control of the National Assembly, and once more, many countries didn't recognize this. The opposition boycotted the vote. This boycott was supported by the US, Canada, the EU, and the Organization of American States. By the end of 2022, the opposition was completely broken. During this time, however, US-Venezuela relations began to improve. The Biden administration allowed Chevron to resume limited operations in Venezuela. This was due to the sharp rise in oil prices caused by the war in Ukraine. In exchange, Maduro opened up for talks with Washington. In 2023, his regime also agreed to plan for a free and fair election in 2024. Washington then removed some of the sanctions on Venezuelan oil and gas. However, this trend reverted in 2024. Maduro failed to provide the roadmap for a free election, and he began provoking Guyana. This was the revival of a centuries-old territorial dispute between the two countries. What territory? Why, the oil-rich Escobedo region. It started to look like Maduro was ready to go to war with Guyana for this territory. Because of this, the Biden administration reimposed sanctions. It got even worse when Maduro once again claimed victory in the 2024 presidential election. However, the opposition also claimed victory in this election. This tension only boiled further when Donald Trump returned to the White House. Throughout this year, Trump has imposed harsher asylum restrictions and deported over 200 alleged Venezuelan gang members. Then there was some exchange of prisoners between the US and Venezuela, mediated by El Salvador. And by August of 2025, Attorney General Pam Bondi announced a $50 million reward for info for Maduro's arrest. This was an increase to the existing $25 million reward by the Department of Justice. In an even bolder move, the Trump administration began building a huge US military presence in the Caribbean Sea. Now, the reason the administration gives is to fight illegal immigration and narco-trafficking. But let's pause here for a second. Before we go on to the boat strikes and the drones, let's break down Venezuela's problem with crime and gang violence. It is all related to the economic fallout of the last few decades that we've talked about. It is also related to the rampant corruption and the authoritarianism of Nicolas Maduro. The latest chapter in Venezuela's economic tragedy brought on a humanitarian crisis. You see, starting in 2014, hyperinflation and corruption led to food and medicine shortages. The government has also been unable to maintain a stable power grid, leading to constant nationwide blackouts. It has also been unable to provide proper social services. On top of that, the spread of infectious diseases has been rampant. This has led to Venezuela becoming one of the poorest countries in the world, with the average income being only 72 cents. Nearly 96% of Venezuelan households are in a state of poverty. These conditions have been years in the making, and all of this laid the perfect groundwork for crime to take over. However, organized crime existed in Venezuela way before 2014. Let's talk about the infamous Cartel of the Suns. This name was first used when two members of Venezuela's anti-drug national command were accused of drug trafficking. It turns out they were working with the CIA. Their job was to infiltrate the Colombian drug cartels trafficking cocaine to the US. The name comes from the sun-looking emblems on their uniforms. However, things got even more interesting in 1998. That year, members of Chavez's revolutionary Bolivarian movement, 200, allegedly created a new drug trafficking group. These were the same men involved in Chavez's failed 1992 coup attempt, by the way. Anyway, this group was known as the Cartel Bolivariano, Bolivarian Cartel. You see, the corruption conditions of the 90s allowed for easy money to be made, especially in drug trafficking. The name, the Cartel of the Suns, came back in 2004, once the Chavez regime was fully established. More members of the military were alleged to be involved in such a group, and the larger problem was that Chavez gave the military unprecedented power. In fact, this was one of the reasons for the rampant mismanagement of PDVSA. The final straw was when Chavez kicked the DEA out of Venezuela in 2005. This immediately made the country even more attractive for drug trafficking. After that, the allegations kept coming. There were reports of Hugo Chavez's security forces arranging drug shipments through Venezuela. There were also reports of the Venezuelan military working with FARC, a Colombian leftist guerrilla in the drug trade. The UK even accused Venezuela of hosting Colombian drug planes in its air force bases. Because of all of these allegations, Washington has now tied Maduro himself to the leadership of the Cartel of the Suns. This makes sense, since most of the accused members are high-ranking military officers appointed by Maduro. In 2020, the US government officially charged Maduro and other government officials with leading the Cartel of the Suns. And there's another large player in the Venezuelan drug world, Tren de Aragua. Spanish for the Train of Aragua. This group was formed in 2014. Right in the middle of another, larger economic catastrophe, this gang rose inside of the Tocoron prison. This prison is located in the Venezuelan state of Aragua, hence the group's name. This group's name may also be linked to a railroad union, building a train between Caracas and Aragua. The gang took over the Tocoron prison. There, they ran a zoo, a swimming pool, a disco, a restaurant, and a bar. Its leaders orchestrated robberies, kidnappings, and murder, all behind bars. The economic tragedy that was hitting Venezuela pushed the gang to go international. They took advantage of the nearly 8 million Venezuelans who fled their country. They began recruiting new members from these expats. The gang established bases in neighboring countries such as Colombia, Peru, and Chile. From there, they smuggled both people and drugs. They also opened extraction rackets and prostitution rings. Their most notorious crime took place last year, in 2024. They kidnapped and murdered Ronald Ojeda. Ojeda was a former Venezuelan army officer who had conspired against Maduro's regime. He fled to Chile. There, gang members disguised as Chilean policemen kidnapped and murdered him. They stuffed his body inside a suitcase, which they then buried in cement. The Tren de Aragua has now also expanded to the United States. In the US, they have 700,000 Venezuelan migrants to recruit from. They were allegedly involved in shooting 2 NYPD police officers. They also killed a former Venezuelan policeman in Florida. The Biden administration labeled the gang as a transnational criminal organization. This year, the Trump administration went even further and named it a foreign terrorist organization. Okay, and now we're all caught up. Ever since retaking office, President Trump has revived the maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela. His administration has continued to accuse Venezuela of trafficking cocaine into the United States. The government has also labeled the Cartel of the Suns as a terrorist organization. This means, technically, that Maduro is now the alleged leader of a terrorist organization. In August of 2025, Trump secretly directed the Pentagon to use military force against Latin American drug cartels. Then came the doubling of the bounty on Maduro. And then the US deployed a fleet of naval warships towards Venezuelan waters. These carried more than 4,500 sailors and Marines. Then came the boat strike. On September 2nd, 2025, US forces struck an alleged Tren de Aragua boat. This boat was supposedly trafficking cocaine to the United States. The strike killed 11 people. This strike was unprecedented because it only involved the Navy and not the Coast Guard. The rest of the naval fleet remains deployed across the Caribbean Sea. This series of attacks might indicate deeper intentions in Venezuela. Some reports speculate of possible US intervention for an outright regime change in Venezuela. This scenario still remains unlikely, however. Regardless, the US has continued to amass its military assets in the region. By October, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment flew helicopters off the Venezuelan coast. The US military also flew 3 B-52 strategic bombers in the region. In the water, the US military also deployed a nuclear submarine. The Trump administration also ordered an end to all diplomatic engagement with Caracas. Trump has now even allowed the CIA to take undercover action in Venezuela. So, where does this leave Venezuela? Its story can show how wealth can quickly fall into crisis when corruption and power get intermixed. Years of mismanagement and weak institutions opened the field for criminal gangs to take over, and the Venezuelan people are the ones who suffer it all. It leads to wonder, what could have been done differently? What if Venezuela didn't throw all of its eggs into one oil-rich basket? What if it diversified its economy? What if its leaders had made different choices? We could spend hours discussing these alternate scenarios, but the most crucial thing is how to move forward now. An outright regime change, sponsored by the US, might be tricky to maintain. Just think back to Afghanistan. However, continued diplomatic pressure might do the trick. The Venezuelan people do want a change. There are options for a democratic government in Venezuela. There are still figures like Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez. They led the opposition in last year's election, and they have considerable proof of their victory over Maduro. Yet the Maduro regime remains in power with many allies left. All in all, we cannot know what the future may hold for Venezuela. But we do know the history. Let Venezuela serve as a cautionary tale about flying too close to the sun. Having billions worth in oil does not guarantee a fair and prosperous, happy ending. If you're tired of getting your news from media outlets owned by billionaires, lobbyists, and government mouthpieces, then you're gonna love Global Recaps. It's our free newsletter where we break down what's really happening in the world, from the Russia-Ukraine war to China's global moves, without sponsors, ads, or censorship. No corporate filters, no both sides spin. Just straight, unfiltered geopolitics. The kind of analysis most mainstream outlets are a little too afraid to touch. We write it ourselves, independently, and we answer to you, not some boardroom in New York or Beijing. If you want a place where the truth still matters, where headlines aren't for sale, and where global stories are told as they are, then join Global Recaps right now. Just click the link in the description or go to globalrecaps.com and sign up. It's free, it takes 10 seconds, and it's the one email you'll actually want to open every week.